Very good. Right. Good evening, everyone. Okay, we've got lots to do this evening, and hi, Jonathan, and I'm quite committed to try and finish bang on time, if not 2 minutes early, as they say in
Cool.
schools. So you can go out and play football in the playground.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so like this, last week we outlined two elements, or actually two approaches to faith to Emunah, and it went basically like this. Very important. One approach was you research as much as possible, you investigate as much as possible, you prove it as much as possible. We're confident that it can be proved, and that's the way to go. In which case, the word emunah, as Jonathan pointed out last night, means faithful to the knowledge that you have already. In other words, faithful to what you've proven. Okay, it's faithfulness as opposed to belief, because emunah requires you to prove it. So once you've proven it, then it's you just have to be faithful to the knowledge. Others say that even though emunah is logical, meaning you can prove it, but you don't need to. There's no need to prove it. You can, however you believe, that's fine. That's basically fine. Now, even that approach doesn't always mean that questions are not good things, meaning we question often, right? Seder night's full of questions, and there are other times we question. But their approach is basically Emunah is not something you need to research, prove, etc. Okay, that is all that. What I would like to do is one of my favorite shiurim actually about Emunah, which we're going to launch into really quickly. I'm going to do this as one of my favorite things. So it goes as follows. It starts with a contradiction in the Rambam, in Maimonides, and what it does is it outlines two levels of faith or belief or knowledge. We're going to get there. Okay, so it starts as follows. If you were writing a book of mitzvot, yeah, a book listing mitzvot in a God-given religion, what would be the first mitzvah on the list? It's a bit of a cheap question because we've been talking about it.
Belief in
Jonathan?
Hashem.
Pardon?
Belief in Hashem.
Believe in Hashem, very good, right? And that's exactly, the Rambam has a book of mitzvahs, the 613, called Sefer HaMitzvahs. Mitzvah number one is belief in Hashem. Great. Okay, very good. So the Rambam's book of 613 mitzvahs, mitzvah number one is belief in God. And we understand why
Can
that
we
would
talk
be.
about a different approach, which said that's definitely not a mitzvah because without it, all the rest of the list is irrelevant?
Gideon, please, please. We're going to say that in about 35 seconds. Okay, so there are other commentaries who have other traditions as to what should be in the 613 mitzvot. One of whom I'm just going to name drop is called the Bahag. I'm not expecting you to remember the names, but the Bahag. The Bahag says, do not belittle Emunah by counting it as one of the 613. Emunah is a prerequisite. If there's no commander, there are no commands. Yeah? So, okay. So far you have a bit of a debate. The Rambam says count Emunah as one of the 613. The Bahag says no, it's prerequisite. Fine. Very good. Right? The issue is there's a contradiction. I want to tell you a great story. When I was growing up, I used to be very friendly with a girl in Hampstead Garden suburb. In fact, our whole family, she was called Lizzie. I'm going to spell Lizzie with a Z. In fact, with two Zs and a Y to protect her anonymity. Yeah. So she was called Lizzie. And at one point, as a 13-year-old, she was asked to go on TV. In fact, the nascent Channel 5, if you remember when it was invented and created, everyone was very excited. And they had some form of teenage version of Gladiators. Not where you had to like run up all these various things, but no, I shouldn't say Gladiators. Teenage version of philosophical debates. That's how I meant to say, right? Whereby they got kids from different religions and each one had to debate their different religion, right? So Lizzie was representing the Jews. As a 13-year-old, that was her thing, okay? Now, they got various denominations of religion on there. And one of the questions, actually a really mean question they asked them all, was as follows. They said to them like this, people, what does your religion say about other religions? Right? In other words, according to your religion, what awaits people who don't believe in your religion? That's a really mean question to ask, right? It's a very English liberal question to ask as well, right? It's like saying, if you believe religiously in wearing helmets when cycling, what do you say about people who don't? You know what I mean? But this is the religious version thereof, yeah? So basically what happened was no disrespect to other religions, every other religion, you basically went down the line and they all said synonyms for hell. Like punishment and eternal damnation and burning and hell. There's all of them, right? And then you got to Lizzie, right? And Lizzie said, actually, we believe that you can be a wonderful non-Jew. You don't have to convert to Judaism. And as long as you obey the 7 Noahide laws, then you get a share in the world to come, right? And Lizzie actually won the debate as a result of that. Now, don't worry, she didn't spark mass conversion to Judaism, obviously. How do I know she won the debate? Because it was a bit like ancient Spain. If you won, then you got kind of threats, and if you lost, you got threats, right? And if you won, you got kicked out. If you lost, you got kicked out of Spain 1,000 years ago. So she actually got threats after the show, unfortunately. She did that well. Anyway, Lizzie was right, meaning the Rambam does write elsewhere that you can be a lovely, fine, upstanding non-Jew, and as long as you keep the 7 Noahide laws, right, you get a share in the world to come. But this is really important, and we don't have time to go through what the 7 Noahide laws are. The Rambam adds a caveat, and he says like this, very important. He says, a non-Jew observing the 7 Noahide laws has to do so because they believe in God, not because they just feel that it's moral to observe these laws, right? So let me distill all of that, and it's as follows. When the Rambam lists the 7 Noahide laws, like don't murder and don't curse God and idols, etc., he does not list Emunah, faith, as one of the 7, right? Why? Because it's a prerequisite. And herein lies our issue. It's where I want to launch off today. And if you get this, great. And if not, the next piece will be understandable anyway. Here's the contradiction. When it came to our 613 mitzvot, the Rambam countered Emunah, countered faith, despite others' objections that it's a prerequisite. When it came to the 7 Noahide laws, the Rambam did not count Emunah, because it's a prerequisite. Hear that? Right? That's exactly the issue. So how does it work? Are we counting him as one of the, or are we not? Comes to the 613 mitzvot, he counts it. Comes to the 7, he doesn't count it. We're good with that? Okay. If you got that, great. If not, then not. Because we're going to use that as a launch pad to discuss 2 different levels of Emunah, and it goes as follows. Once upon a time, there was a fellow called Noach. Noach was told by God in no uncertain terms there's going to be a flood. Yet, the verses say, Noach was very cautious. Noach did not enter the ark until the waters were lashing down. Right? Why? So the Rashi comments, because Noach didn't fully believe. It says Noach believed, but he didn't fully believe. Now, here the issue, and we'll use this to explore everything. I don't understand. God comes to you and says there's going to be a flood. What do you mean you don't believe? It's a practical joke. I'm saying, if it's God, there's it's a kind of this experience where it's clearly God speaking. So where's there room for lack of belief? I know plenty of people, teenagers, who tell me, Rabbi, if God only told me what to do clearly, I'd be great. Yeah? Whether it's true, I don't know. But I'm saying, where was there room for lack of belief? Right. So here I want to tell you, I'm disclosing a story which is not to be repeated. It is the story of our first baby being born, David. Okay. So let me tell you the story. It goes like this. We were living in Israel at the time, and we were living.
Just remember, you're being recorded.
I'm being recorded. It's true. It's true. But my wife isn't going to watch this. Exactly. We're going to try for that. Good. Okay, so like this. We were living in Israel at the time, Jerusalem. We just moved to a new neighborhood actually in Jerusalem. My wife was 8 months pregnant, and we were eating at good friends of ours, Yitzi and Ruti David. He's now the head of Chazak, good friends of ours. And we were there Friday night, and Yitzi kind of pulls me over and says to me, he says, Daniel, as you should know that your wife doesn't know she's having a baby. Yeah. So I said, Yitzi, what are you talking about? Look, we've got the ultrasounds, we've got the pictures. My wife is a bit larger than she is normally. What do you mean she doesn't know she's having a baby? He says, trust me, she doesn't know. Fine. Okay. I thought it was like some Swardi Kabbalistic thing that he was telling me. Fine. Okay. Fast forward 3 weeks, and Yitzi and Ruti are joining us on the way to the hospital because my wife's gone into labor. And the birthing coach decides not to pick up her phone for some odd reason. So Ruti becomes the birthing coach. This actually happened with our second child as well. We're in the hospital, walking around, etc., waiting for labor to start kind of in proper earnest. We're waiting. Anyway, fast forward a little bit after that. And I remember very clearly my wife's first words after giving birth to David. Very important words they were as well. I will quote them verbatim. She looks at David and she says, utters the immortal words, "Oh my God, it's a baby." Those were the words. "Oh my God, it's a baby." Yeah. Which I tell you what that means is as follows. And of course, my wife was very aware that she was having a baby. Yeah. There's a big difference between being aware over here. That means for those listening, I'm pointing to my head, and being aware in an ingrained fashion. Yeah, I remember when we were living in Israel, I was once in a taxi, back several times. If you ever want your emunah to be tested, I think being in a taxi in Israel is probably the way to do that. I actually once had a taxi driver fall asleep on me in his taxi one late Thursday night. So he was smoking like, I don't know how to describe someone who smokes a lot, like a nuclear chimney. He turns around to me, says, "Dangle, it's really bad to smoke." I said, "Yeah, fancy that." Meaning that there was some dissonance. So we know this well. There's a dissonance between knowing something in the brain and really living something. Yeah, that was the experience. That was the experience. You can know that something's happening. You have all the pictures, And by the way, teenagers and others are great at this. They can know what they should be doing in life, right? But it's kind of some knowledge that they can repeat to you in their head, but it doesn't filter down to their heart. Yeah. Says the Stipler, and I want to use this as the next springboard. There's two levels of emunah, really important. There is knowing something intellectually, and there's knowing something in an ingrained fashion. That's called emunah chushit. Chush means a sensual sense. Yeah. You can know something intellectually. Noach knew the flood was coming. Of course he did. But he hadn't ingrained that. He hadn't made that part of who he was. He hadn't had that knowledge filter down that long journey between the head and the heart. Make sense? Great. Okay.
In that example with Noah, surely it could just be a heavy storm. There would have been heavy storms only when he realized that this is not a heavy storm, which could happen frequently. Then it's going to be the start of the flood. Like, I don't see why that's such a problem for him.
This wasn't just a heavy storm. This was waters everywhere, I think, opening. If God told you that there was like an abnormal flood coming and you see abnormal weather and like rain everywhere and the water levels rising, etc., you've got to be a brave man to say, could be a flood. It's probably just, we've reached Manchester. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, basically. I don't think he thought it was some kind of like the ice caps melting situation. Okay. Now I want to now get back into that Rambam and use one more springboard and make it very, very relevant. I know we're going a little bit quick, but I want to keep a little bit of this pace, and then we'll develop something really well. Please God. Do you remember we said the Rambam counts Emunah as one of the 613, the mitzvah belief, but he doesn't count it as one of the 7. Yeah. So I'm going to use this model to explain the Rambam. The Maharam Shik, who was a student of the Chassam Sofer, lived in the 1800s. He was a rabbi in Hungary. Got some Hungarian fans here. Got a rabbi in Hungary. He was a rabbi of a yeshiva of 800 people. Maharam Shik, his surname was Shik. He writes as follows. He says like this: the Rambam is going with this idea too, meaning what the Rambam is doing is saying like this: there are 2 levels of emunah. There is emunah which is up here in the brain, intellectual, right? Let's call it proof, right? And then there's emunah which is sensual, which is deep, which is ingrained. When it comes to R613, yeah, the Rambam counts emunah as one of R613 mitzvot because that mitzvah is the mitzvah of emunah which is ingrained, the deep one, the sensual one. right? The intellectual one is just a prerequisite. That the Rambam is dealing with when it comes to 7 Noachide laws, and therefore he doesn't count that separately. In other words, let me try and do that again, distill that. These two levels of Emunah, knowing in the brain and knowing in the heart, knowing in the brain is a prerequisite for all mitzvot. That the Rambam doesn't codify because it's a prerequisite. Therefore, in the 7 Noachide laws, he doesn't need to count that as a separate mitzvah. When it comes to R613, it's not just about the head, it's about getting down into the heart. And that does deserve a separate mention, a separate mitzvah. I'm going to distill that even further and then use this as a second springboard. Okay? As follows. What I've basically said is that when it comes to the Jewish people, we've got a different level of mitzvah of emunah, belief in God, than any other nation. Right? We have to go deeper. And the question is why? Right? And
we see that in the example. So from what I understand, one of the Noahide laws is don't murder, and that's what they've got to do, not murder, or what they've got to avoid.
That's true.
Whereas for us, we've got don't murder, but we take it far, far deeper. Like, for example, to the extent of not using bladed tools to build the altar.
That's true. That's just another mitzvah. Some argue, by the way, that the non-Jewish mitzvah not to murder is actually more strict. There's some elements that are much more strict. And without being too grotesque, there's something, for example, murdering a fetus is actually more actionable when it comes to a non-Jew doing it than when it comes to a Jew doing it. Often, some of the Noachide laws, by virtue of the fact that only 7 are actually stricter, right? But I'm talking about just not the laws, but the emunah element of the laws, right? So let's go one level deeper, albeit a little bit more practical and a bit less esoteric. Where was there a point in history where God did something and turned around to the nations of the world, or a nation emblematic of the world, and said, now you have to believe in me? What was that?
To the Egyptians.
Excellent, right? When we left Egypt. The whole time, the plagues, Hashem says, I'm doing it in order you should know there's no one like me in the sky, no one like me in the land, no one like me. Yeah? Where is our historical event that necessitated belief in God? What was like our capital experience of belief in God?
Sinai.
Excellent, Sinai. Very good. Very good, Jonathan. You're giving the share next week, yeah? Sinai, right? Which is interesting. Now, for all the other nations, the plagues was like the gold standard. And for us, getting the Torah at Mount Sinai was the gold standard, right? Which it's an interesting, why is that? I think the plagues were like lacking. Understand? You saw God. You saw the lice and the frogs and we actually don't say, in my house, saying lice is very sensitive, right? The plague of lice was rampant when we were growing up. Like my sisters used to fail like every lice check ever in school. I just remember that the smell of that shampoo when my mum had to comb my sister's hair is like some people smell chicken soup when they grow up. We just smelled that. Anyway, so be that as it may, the 10 plagues, I mean, you got proof that God existed. That's a massive level of proof. What was added when it came to Mount Sinai? What was different that we have a higher level? And here's where I really want to quantify, actually qualify, to be honest.
That was more of a personal or, certainly a national thing, whereas the plagues actually, was probably in many ways the height of miracles for even us. The idea that God is in control of everything, whether it's high level or low level, high level detailed, whatever it is, that's still for us. But Sinai was specific to the Jews.
That's true. It was exclusive, but you could argue that the plagues were exclusive to the Egyptians. But I love your questions, by the way. Firstly, because they're great. Secondly, because it allows me to take a quick snack on the side. So 2 levels. So I want to take it in this direction. Yeah, it goes as follows. If I ask a person, it's very important, don't laugh at this, yeah? How do you know you are awake? A dangerous thing to ask when you're giving a shit, right? Or how do you know you exist? So that let me make it more approachable. How do you know? And how do you know? Let's say I have 2 couples in front of me, and I say, how do you know that let's say I ask 2 wives, how do you know that your husband loves you? Right? So wife A takes out an iPad and says, look, last week he said he loved me. 2 weeks ago, he went to the cinema with me. 3 weeks ago, went out to a restaurant. 4 weeks ago, we had a bit of an argument. 5 weeks ago, and it does, 83% over the last year. He loves me. Yeah. Okay. Then I go to couple number two and I say, how do you know your husband loves you? So she looks me in the eye and she says, Rabbi, how could you ask such a thing? Yeah. I feel it. I feel my husband loves me. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying who's more convincing, but who would you say has the stronger relationship, A or B?
B.
Pardon?
B.
B, excellent. Right, right. Now why is that? Let's delve down into that. So the reason is in our Western world, we think that only if it's provable does it exist. Now, I'm not saying you don't question, but only if it's provable does it exist. The Jewish thought is as follows. I need to prove something if the information lives outside of me. If it already lives within me, I don't need to prove it because I innately grasp it anyway. So, for example, how do you know you're awake? Oh, you could prove sensorily, etc. You could maybe you're dreaming that you're having a share with Rabbi Fine. I don't know why you'd ever do that, right? But you could kind of, if you're asked to prove it, not how do you know how prove you exist? So yeah, you've got philosophers debating that for centuries, so to speak, right? It sounds funny. The answer is I know I exist because I know I exist. I know I'm awake because I know I'm awake, right? I'm not debunking the physiological, etc. But at the end of the day, there's certain things you grasp and therefore don't need to prove. If I ask you, how do I know that God is there? How do I know the Torah is true? Right? So we could go through proofs. You could say, look, how are you ever going to convince 1 million people that God spoke to them? How are you going to do that? You're not going to believe me if I told you that, I don't know, me and 500 friends jumped off the Eiffel Tower yesterday in full view of everyone. Right? Why? Because you'd say, well, why haven't I heard of it? And you're definitely not going to believe me if I said, well, me and my friends and I jumped off the Eiffel Tower, and therefore I want you to change your lives. Because you say, well, no way. Why haven't I heard of it? And you're not believe me if I say, well, 500 friends and I jumped on the Eiffel Tower, right? And I'm there's going to be like a total change in history because of it. And now you're going to have to keep Shabbos and eat kosher and all this kind of, you're not going to, there's no, why would you want to believe me? Right? And on the contrary, if it's a public miracle you're claiming, like well, the answer normally response is, well, why haven't I heard of it? Especially if it's unlikely, right? So to convince 1 million people that they heard God spoke is not so easy to convince, right? Now, especially... Pardon?
Just a quick question. What you were saying before about, the kind of like the proof aspect.
Yeah.
It made me think of, like in courts, right? There's the concept of, innocent till proven guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Do we sort of take that concept and apply it to God in a way? And are we saying that God exists until you can prove that he
proven
doesn't?
Otherwise? No, you have to come to some realization he exists. It's funny, when I was a teenager and I went through like a kind of proving God stage, and it is it all right stage, is it all true stage. At one point I woke up, this is like my breakthrough. I kind of like worked out certain proof and I was like, hold on a second. God probably exists, irrespective of whether or not I managed to prove him. It was like a bit of a light bulb moment. But yeah, fair point. So coming back, right? You can't convince 1 million people they heard God spoke, especially if the Torah itself says it will never be forgotten. So how are you going to do that? I would add that we have record of Jewish observance until around 800 years after the Torah was given. In other words, if I ask you, how do you know the Torah wasn't made up yesterday? Just an example, right? You'll say, well, we were keeping it last week. We had a shir, right? How do you know the Torah, for example, wasn't made up, I don't know, 100 years ago? You got grandparents, great-grandparents, 900 years ago. We've got books. We've got commentaries on the Torah, 2,000 years ago. We've got the Septuagint, which is the translation of Torah into Greek. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can get to within about, like I said, 800 years to when we say the Torah was given. So in order for the Torah to be made up, you've got someone coming along and saying, 800 years ago, 1 million people heard God speak, right? And therefore, I want you to change your lives and eat kosher and etc. And by the way, they didn't just randomly hear God speak. They came out of Egypt, like that massive super society. If you've never heard of that, you're never going to believe that. And it says it will never be forgotten, and it happened to your ancestors, right? Or the fact that the book says The Torah says you're going to be small, you're going to be scattered, you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be a light unto the nations, and you're going to survive. And it's all happened, and it's all been predicted, and it's all totally rare. Yeah, I mean, meaning those are lovely, and those are proofs. Yeah, that's what we had. That's what the Egyptians were privy to have with the 10 plagues. In other words, they had deductive proof that God existed. Yeah, but as we said before, you only need to prove something when it exists outside of you. Right? This is really important, the last 2-3 minutes. Right? If I ask you, how do you know you exist? Well, I know I exist because I carry that consciousness with me. Right? You ask couple B, how does she know that he loves her? She carries that consciousness with. Right? How do I know that you're Jewish? I carry that consciousness with. How do I know that Torah is true? Well, on some level, we carry that consciousness with us. In other words, the highest level of the highest level of belief was when we got to Mount Sinai. We didn't need to prove it because we lived that information. Yeah, that is the Emunah Chushis. That is that deep ingrained faith that was present at Mount Sinai. Yeah, let me just end with this point. The Ramban had to debate the king, Pablo Cristiani, in front of the king of Spain about Christianity and Judaism, etc. And he had various, intellectual proofs. In his commentary on the Torah, he asked, how do you know God is true? How do you know Torah is true? He says, because parents don't lie to children. And they have a tradition, and we know, the generations, and we've handed it down from the Exodus, Mount Sinai, all the way down. Right? I'm a parent. I try not to lie to my child. Yeah, but why say parents don't lie to children when you've got all this, in his debates, he proved history and talked about intellectual proofs. Like, why relegate it to parents don't lie to children? So the idea is the same thing. When a child hears something from a parent, they live that instinctively. They don't feel a need to question. That's why as parents have a responsibility. They don't feel a need to then question. It's a level of knowledge which is beyond. So if I had to ask you, top level of faith is Mount Sinai. Why is it Mount Sinai? Because it's ingrained, it's essential, it's who we are. But let me finish with an anecdote, and then next week we're going to look at the sister mitzvah of Emunah, which is bitachon, trust in God. The anecdote is as follows. I told a story about my wife before that Gideon said may get out, so I'll do another one. When my second child, Miriam, was I'd say going to be born, because we were still my wife was still pregnant. We had a scan, and we saw there was a blood, you call it a blood spot on the scan, and it can inhibit growth, and it's not very good. Right, so we were very concerned, and my wife went home and did what a good Jewish woman does, and she gave tzedakah and said son Tehillim, etc. And she had this interesting premonition. Said, "Let's go for another scan." This is like 2 days later, right? And we went for another scan, and lo and behold, the thing had just completely disappeared. Not the baby, Baruch Hashem. I mean, the blood thing completely disappeared. No one knew why. No one had an explanation, and that I think is a level of what's called like Emunah Chushis, meaning you live with it. There's needing to prove something, that's one level, but there's living with that Emunah. Okay, so those two levels. In summary, even if one needs to prove it, which is fine, it shouldn't stay at the level of proof. It should get to a level of ingrained living within me. That's kind of where we want to be. Good? Okay, a lot to digest. It's a bit quick. Please go next week. We'll look at the sister mitzvah, which is bitachon. See you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.